Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to today's Sutta study and welcome to the last session of our course about the transition years. Today we are reading the Bakkulasutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 124. And this is quite a late sutta. It is said at least several decades after the suttas we have read so far. So it will be interesting to explore how things have developed since the last suttas that we read together in the last few weeks. But before we start, we will chant the Namo Tassa, and feel free to join me if you would like to chant along. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, welcome to everybody who has joined in. Welcome to Geeta, who has typed in the chat. And welcome to everybody else who is listening but not typing. Nice to see you, Geeta. Thank you for joining in. So today we are reading the Bakkulasutta. I will be reading from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. And there is a link in the description box, and I think the link goes to Bhante Sujato's translation. And yes, so let's get started. Thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Venerable Bakkula was living at Jatakaha in the bamboo grove, the squirrel's sanctuary. Then Achela Kassapa, a former companion of the Venerable Bakkula in his lay life, went to the Venerable Bakkula and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down at one side and asked the Venerable Bakkula. So here we have Achela Kassapa. If you are looking at Bhante Sujato's translation, you will see he translated Kassapa, the naked ascetic. So the word Achela means naked ascetic. So it seems that Kassapa wasn't a layperson, he was a non-Buddhist ascetic practitioner. So a non-Buddhist renunciate. And he asks the Venerable Bakkula, "Friend Bakkula, how long is it since you went forth?" "It is 80 years since I went forth, friend." So here we see Bakkula has been in robes for 80 years at the point of this sutta. And this shows us how late this sutta is. Because as we know, the Buddha only taught for 45 years. So the Buddha attained enlightenment when he was 35 years old, and he attained parinibbana when he was 80 years old. So he taught for 45 years. So that means that even if Bakkula went forth in the first year of the Buddha's teaching, still this sutta must be said at least 35 years after the Buddha's parinibbana. So 34 years after all the suttas we have read in the last few weeks about the first council, and the one we read about Ananda last time, the Gopaka Moggallana Sutta, and so on. So this sutta shows us that the development that took place in the decades after that time. And it is quite likely that this sutta takes place more than 35 years after the Buddha's passing, because Bakkula is a very marginal character in the Pali Canon. He doesn't appear in any other sutta. The only place where he appears is in the list of foremost disciples in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Book of Wands, where Bakkula is the foremost of the monks who have good health. But otherwise, he doesn't appear elsewhere. And so it's quite likely that he ordained more towards the end of the Buddha's life, and that's why he isn't featured much in any other suttas. So this sutta might take place anywhere between 35 years after the Buddha's passing to almost 80 years after the Buddha's passing. So significantly later than all the suttas we have read so far. And now Kassapa, the naked ascetic, asks Bakula, friend Bakula, in these 80 years, how many times have you engaged in sexual intercourse? Friend Kassapa, you should not ask me such a question as that. You should ask me such a question as this. Friend Bakula, in these 80 years, how many times have perceptions of sensual desire arisen in you? So Bakula points out to his friend that obviously this is an inappropriate question. As a Buddhist monastic, he cannot engage in sexual intercourse. He would have to disrobe immediately. And he tells him to ask a much more subtle question about perceptions that arise in the mind. So much more subtle states of sensual desire than, coarse bodily actions of sexual intercourse. And Kassapa then asks the question in the way Bakula suggested, and Bakula then answers, friend Kassapa, in the 80 years since I went forth, I do not recall any perception of sensual desire to have ever arisen in me. That in the 80 years since he went forth, the Venerable Bakula did not recall any perception of sensual desire to have ever arisen in him. This we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula. So here we have a very curious little passage where obviously someone else has inserted something into the text and is rejoicing in the quality that Bakula has, the quality that sensual perceptions never arise in him. And this passage that was inserted here is from the redactors of the Second Council. We read the story of the First Council, which was a group of monks that came together to preserve the Buddha's teaching after the Buddha's passing. And then roughly 100 years after that, the monks held another council, which is called the Second Council. And at that council, they discussed various Vinaya matters, and they also included more texts in the Pali Tipitaka, or in the Tipitaka in general, not only the Pali version. And here, obviously, they also included this sutta, and they were quite impressed with Bakula. So all throughout this sutta, which we are reading now, there will be these insertions from the redactors of the Second Council where they praise Bakula and rejoice in his qualities. So here we have a sutta of which the redactors of the Second Council found extremely inspiring. This is the only sutta in the entire Pali Canon where redactors of the Second Council inserted any kind of inserted passages like this one, where they praise a monastic and rejoice. So this is apparently they thought that Bakula was a really inspiring person. His practices were really amazing. He was seen as a kind of role model for the sangha at this time. So by studying this sutta, we can really understand what the sangha at this point in time, like about 100 years after the Buddha, found inspiring, and what kind of practices they thought were worth practicing and worth following. So the first quality that they rejoice in is this fact that perceptions of sensual desire never arise in Bakula. And that's, of course, something that is very much in line also with the early suttas, very much in line with the Buddha's teaching. I think something that everybody who follows the Buddha's teaching can rejoice in. So, and then Bakula continues and says, friend, in the 80 years since I went forth, I do not recall any perception of ill will and any perception of cruelty to have ever arisen in me. That in the 80 years since he went forth, the Venerable Bakula did not recall any perception of ill will or any perception of cruelty to have ever arisen in him. This we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula. And then Bakula continues, in the 80 years since I went forth, I do not recall any thought of sensual desire to have ever arisen in me, or any thought of ill will and any thought of cruelty to have ever arisen in me. And this too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula. So this list of sensual desire ill will and cruelty is a standard thing in the early suttas too. And here we see, first of all, he's talking about perceptions of sensual desire, ill will, and cruelty. And then he's talking about thoughts. And he says he never had any of these. And the reductors of the second council rejoice. And again, this is something that is very much standard, very much in line also with the early way of teaching. And now Bakkula speaks about some of his practices in more detail. And first, he's talking about his practices regarding robes. So as we know, monastics, when they go forth, they rely on the 4 requisites to sustain their life, which is robes, alms, food, lodging, and medicinal requisites. And in this order, Bakkula is now talking about his practices regarding those 4 requisites. And the first one is robes. And Bakkula says, "Friend, in the 80 years since I went forth, I do not recall ever having accepted a robe from a householder, ever having worn a robe given by a householder, ever having cut a robe with a cutter, ever having sewn a robe with a needle, ever having colored a robe with dye, ever having sewn a robe at the Katina time, and ever having worked on making robes for my companions in the holy life. And this too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakkula." So here Bakkula describes his practice regarding robes. And the first thing he describes is that he doesn't accept robes from lay people, from householders, and he also doesn't wear robes given by lay people. So usually that means that Bakkula undertakes ascetic practices. And as we will see, Bakkula is quite an ascetic monastic. And if you undertake ascetic practices, normally that means that you wear rag robes. That means that you collect discarded cloth, and then you stitch it together and make your robe that way. But Bakkula isn't doing that either. He says he has never cut a robe, he has never sewn a robe, he has never dyed a robe. So clearly he has never made a robe. So where does he get his robes from? It's a little bit mysterious. He doesn't clearly say where he got his robe from. I discussed this with a few other monastics, with a few other people. And some people suggested that maybe he got it from other monastics. Other monastics made the robe for him. Or maybe they gave him an old robe that they no longer were using. Or some people suggested he made them with his psychic powers. Yeah, it's not quite clear how he got robes, but he didn't undertake the usual ascetic practices, which are wearing rag robes and making rag robes. So clearly he's trying to be even more ascetic than just wearing rag robes, because wearing rag robes still means that you have to make a robe. And he has never sewn a robe at the Katina time. So the Katina time is the traditional time of robe making for monastics. It's usually in October, like 1 month in October and November. And it's the month after the end of the rains retreat. So after the 3 months of the retreat, when the monastics traditionally began wandering again, that was a good time to put your robes in order, to make new robes, so that you're prepared for the time of wandering when you're not in an established settlement and when you can't easily make robes. And if you make robes at the Katina time, there is usually there is a big ceremony called the Katina ceremony. This is the biggest celebration for monastics in the year. And people come together and they make this Katina robe. And if you participate in that ceremony as a monastic, then you get certain privileges. And that means for a few months, certain rules of your patimokkha, of the monastic code, are being relaxed. And that means it's easier for you to visit lay people, to mingle with lay people. And that is purposely made this way so that it's easier for you to, when you have easy access to lay people, it's easier to get a robe cloth. So it's easier for you to actually make robes, to get enough cloth and then to make robes. But Bakula is not interested in mingling with lay people. We will see that again later. He really keeps away from everyone, so he doesn't even participate in the Katina ceremony. And since he's not making robes, he's also not interested in getting cloth. And he also has never worked on making robes for his companions in the holy life, so he never helped others to make robes. He's even keeping away from other Sangha members. So these are his practices regarding robes. And again, the redactors at the Second Council rejoice in all these wonderful and marvelous things that he undertakes here. And now Bakula describes his practices regarding the second requisite, which is alms food. And he says, "Friend, in the 80 years since I went forth, I do not recall ever having accepted an invitation to a meal, ever having given rise to the thought, oh, may someone invite me to a meal? Ever having sat down inside a house, ever having eaten inside a house. And this too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula." So Bakula obviously doesn't accept invitations from lay people to have specially offered food. And he also doesn't wish for that to happen. So that very likely means that he goes on alms round. He undertakes the ascetic practice of going on alms round. And it seems that he avoids even entering houses because he just doesn't sit down there. He never eats there. So we see again, he really tries to limit contact with the lay people. And now Bakula talks about his practices regarding women. And we have seen over the last few weeks of our course that in the early Sangha, there were different attitudes towards women. Some people, the group around Ananda was extremely supportive of women and of bhikkhunis. And another group that is more associated with Mahakassapa and the ascetic monks was a lot more hesitant towards women. They had some misogynistic attitudes. And in the story of the first council, we also saw that they thought that it was a mistake that the Buddha allowed bhikkhunis and that women should not be in the Sangha. So here Bakula describes his own practices around women. And he says, "Friend, in the 80 years since I went forth, I do not recall ever having grasped at the signs and features of a woman, ever having taught the Dhamma to a woman, even as much as a 4-line stanza, ever having gone to the bhikkhuni's quarters, ever having taught the Dhamma to a bhikkhuni, ever having taught Dhamma to a female probationer, that is a sikkamana, ever having taught the Dhamma to a female novice, that is a samaneri. And this too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula." So here we see Bakula also keeps away from women, even to the point that he is not willing to teach Dhamma to women. So we can clearly see he makes a strong gender difference between men and women, and he's not willing to even teach Dhamma to women. Like not even a tiny bit, like he says, not even a 4-line stanza, which is the smallest amount of Dhamma that you could potentially teach to someone. And he's not even teaching bhikkhunis or female members of the Sangha, which is quite interesting because monks and nuns actually, they in their patimokkha's, in the Vinaya rules, they actually have duties towards each other, such as teaching each other and attending teachings. So if a monk is not willing to do that, he's kind of avoiding some of the duties that are in the monk's patimokkha. And of course, if a single monk does that, it's not a big deal. And every single monk can, of course, decide how they want to practice. But once that monk becomes elevated to the point that Bakula is being elevated here in this sutta, where the redactors of the Second Council call this a wonderful and marvelous quality, and they really raise him up and put him on a pedestal and establish him as a role model, then of course large numbers of other people think they should follow this kind of this way of practice, and then it becomes very difficult. And the Sangha actually only thrives if the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis have a good relationship with each other. But if there are these kind of tensions, and if there's so much reluctance, then things become very, very difficult, and the harmony between the two sanghas is actually quite out of balance. And again, if Bakula was just any like random monk, that wouldn't be a problem. But since this is the only sutta where the redactors of the Second Council insert this kind of praise, it seems that they really thought that this was an amazing way of handling things. So he was really, really raised up as a role model for others. And then things become a little bit difficult. And then Bakula continues to describe his practices towards other members of the Bhikkhu Sangha. And there he says, "Friend, in the 80 years since I went forth, I do not recall ever having given the going forth, ever having given the full admission." So these are the Samanera ordination and the Bhikkhu ordination in the male Sangha. "Ever having given dependence and ever having had a novice wait on me." And this too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula. So giving dependence, in Pali this is called nisaya. This is actually a period after full ordination where the newly ordained monastic stays with a teacher or with a mentor for a few years, 5 years for the monks and 2 years for the nuns, where the new monastic learns all the things that they need to know about Vinaya, about the Dhamma, about meditation, about general Sangha life, like everything you need to know to be a thriving member of the Sangha should be taught to you during this dependence period. But if you are a very experienced older monastic, such as Bakula, who has been in robes for 80 years, and who apparently is a great role model here, refuses to teach the younger ones, then of course, it makes it a little bit difficult for the younger ones to thrive, and it makes it a little bit difficult for the Sangha also to continue. Like if everybody followed this role model of Bakula, then nobody would ever get ordained and the Sangha would die out very quickly. But again, we see how much he is reluctant to even mingle with the Bhikkhu Sangha. But the redactors of the Second Council rejoice in these qualities. And to me, this is very interesting. Like we see Bakula practicing in a way that is so ascetic that it does seem a little bit out of balance. And it's a practice that we only find in this sutta. We don't find these kind of practices praised anywhere else in the Pali canon. So for example, we have Mahakassapa. We have read a few suttas where he featured very prominently. We know that Mahakassapa was the foremost among the monks of those who undertake ascetic practices. So the Buddha himself named Mahakassapa as the role model for ascetic practices. But even Mahakassapa did not go to such extremes when practicing in the Sangha. So we know Mahakassapa had students, we know Mahakassapa ordained, we know Mahakassapa trained the younger monks, we know he gave Dhamma talks. We even know that he went to the Bhikkhunis and he taught the Bhikkhunis. He seemed to have a little bit of reluctance teaching Bhikkhunis, and he seemed to have a little bit of a difficult attitude towards women in the Sangha. But we have read suttas, especially 3 weeks ago when we read the Chivara Sutta and the Upasaya Sutta. We saw Mahakassapa going to the Bhikkhuni quarters and in the Upasaya Sutta, and we saw him teaching the Bhikkhunis. So even Mahakassapa, who was the foremost among the monks who undertook ascetic practices, did not go to such length as Bakula went. And because Mahakassapa was praised as the foremost of the monks by the Buddha, I think people who are practicing more in a more ascetic way than Mahakassapa, these kind of practices are probably a little bit questionable, and it's not quite clear if the Buddha would have approved of that, I think. But here, as I mentioned, this is a later sutta, and the Buddha is no longer living at this time. And then now in the next passage, Bakula explains his practices with regards to the last two requisites, with regards to lodging and with regards to medicine. And he says, "Friend, in the 80 years since I went forth, I do not recall ever having bathed in a bathhouse, ever having bathed with bath powder, ever having undertaken the work of massaging the limbs of my companions in the holy life, ever having had an affliction arise in me, even for as long as it takes to milk a cow, ever having carried medicine around, even as much as a piece of gallnut, ever having used a bolster, ever having made up a bed, ever having entered upon the residence for the rains in a resting place inside a village. And this too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula." So here we see he's not bathing inside houses either. Probably that means he's bathing in rivers, which was a common practice also in the early days. And again, he's not getting involved with any activities of the sangha. He doesn't look after sick monks, like he doesn't massage the limbs of the companions in the holy life, probably when they're sick and need massaging. And he's never sick. We already, like I already told, the foremost quality of Bakula was that he was the foremost of the monks who had good health. He never got sick. He didn't carry medicine around. And again, he doesn't use bolsters, like he doesn't use extra, like a little bit luxury items. And he doesn't spend the rains inside a village. So as I mentioned before, for the period of the rains retreat, these 3 months, monastics have to stay in one place. They cannot wander around. So you have to decide where you want to spend your 3 months for the rains. And you can spend it in a village or in the wilderness. And of course, Bakula keeps away from the lay people. So he is not spending time in the village. And then Bakula says, "Friend, for 7 days after going forth, I ate the country's alms food as a debtor. On the 8th day, final knowledge arose." And that for 7 days, the Venerable Bakula ate the country's alms food as a debtor, and on the 8th day, final knowledge arose. This too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula. So Bakula says after his ordination, he practiced for 7 days and became an arahant on the 8th day. And we again see this metaphor of eating the country's alms food as a debtor. We already saw that in the Chivara Sutta 3 weeks ago, where Mahakassapa used this image. And I've explained it there in detail. So you can look it up there if you don't remember. Then on the 8th day, Bakula became an arahant. And at this point, Kassapa, the naked ascetic, seems to be quite inspired. And he says, "I would receive the going forth in this dhamma and discipline. I would receive the full admission." So Kassapa, the naked ascetic, might be inspired by these kind of ascetic practices because he has already gone forth. He is already a naked ascetic. So being a naked ascetic obviously means that he also does quite severe ascetic practices. He doesn't even wear any clothes. So maybe this sutta speaks to him. These kind of practices speak to him. He's quite inspired. And he's now asking for the going forth and the full ordination. And he receives the going forth and the full ordination. Obviously not by Bakula, because Bakula doesn't ordain. I'm assuming he found somebody else to carry out the ordination ceremony. And soon, not long after his full admission, dwelling alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute, the Venerable Kassapa, by realizing for himself with direct knowledge, he and now entered upon and abided in that supreme goal of the holy life, for the sake of which cleansmen rightly go forth from the home life into homelessness. He knew directly, birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, there is no more coming to any state of being. And the Venerable Kassapa became one of the arahants. So, happy ending for the Venerable Kassapa. He becomes an arahant. And then on a later occasion, the Venerable Bakula took a key and went from dwelling to dwelling, saying, "Come forth, Venerable Sirs, come forth, Venerable Sirs. Today I shall attain final nibbana." That the Venerable Bakula took a key and went from dwelling to dwelling, saying, "Come forth, Venerable Sirs, come forth, Venerable Sirs. Today I shall attain final nibbana. This too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula." And then, seated in the midst of the sangha of bhikkhus, the Venerable Bakula attained final nibbana. That seated in the midst of the sangha of bhikkhus, the Venerable Bakula attained final nibbana. This too we remember as a wonderful and marvelous quality of the Venerable Bakula. So, this is the end of today's sutta. We see Bakula undertaking practices, quite severe ascetic practices, as I mentioned, significantly more strict than even what Mahakassapa practiced. So it is a little bit doubtful if the Buddha would have approved. It does seem a little bit out of balance, some of those practices. But clearly, at this later point in time, people found this very, very inspiring. So again, this tells us something about how the Sangha evolved and developed and what kind of mindset prevailed in the Sangha during the decades and maybe the first century after the Buddha's passing. Because as I mentioned, the Second Council was held about 100 years after the Buddha's passing. And clearly there was a strong tendency towards more asceticism at this time. We already saw at the First Council, which was held straight after the Buddha's parinibbana, the group around Mahakassapa prevailed, which was again the ascetic group, but things became more and more ascetic over the next few decades. And that's quite interesting, and especially that this kind of practice is praised so much and that Bakula is seen so much as a role model. Because if you recall, last time we read the Gopaka Moggallana Sutta, where Ananda talks with a few Brahmin ministers, one Brahmin minister and a general and a few others. And there Ananda gives 10 qualities that were given by the Buddha to evaluate other monastics. And if they have those 10 qualities, then we should respect, revere, and venerate them, honor, respect, revere, and venerate them, and live in dependence on them. So these are qualities given by the Buddha, and then again repeated by Ananda after the Buddha's passing, to see whether a monastic is really truly inspiring and worthy of honor and worthy of taking dependence on. And these 10 qualities are clearly very significantly different from the qualities that are praised here in the Venerable Bakula. So back in the sutta we read last time, it was, of course, the first one was keeping patimokkha. So I'm assuming Bakula also kept patimokkha. The second one is having learned much. The third one is being content. Bakula obviously also is content. So there is a little bit of overlap between those lists. But then it continues having the jhanas. Then it continues having the psychic powers, having the divine eye, the divine ear, being able to mind read, being able to remember the past lives, and so on. So if Bakula had those qualities, which we don't know, it's not mentioned here in this sutta. It's not what Bakula is praised for. He is praised for entirely different things here. So clearly there was kind of a shift in priorities over time in the early Sangha. And so from the instructions that the Buddha gave himself, we see an evolution, and we see that other things were found inspiring at this later point in time. And with this sutta now, we're coming to the end of our course about the transition years. Over the last 2 months, we have explored many suttas about this period in time. We have seen different developments happening in the Sangha. We have seen different ideas emerging, different groups having different priorities and different plans for the future of the Sangha. Especially we have seen the group around Ananda, which was a more socially engaged group, a more group that was open to lay people, to teaching and to mingling with lay people, and also a group very supportive of women and very supportive of bhikkhuni ordination. And on the other hand, we have seen a group around Mahakassapa, very ascetic, very reclusive, keeping away from lay people, and also being having quite difficult attitudes towards women and towards bhikkhunis. And then here in this last sutta, we saw over time these tendencies got stronger. And we also see that these are still things that we are discussing nowadays in modern times. We, like as monastics and as lay people, we're still wondering how reclusive should we be? How much should we interact with the general society? And also, for example, the attitudes towards women, we're still having exactly the same discussions than what we had 2,500 years ago. And of course, there are also individual differences. Some people tend to being more reclusive, others tend to being more socially engaged. But also generally over time, we see these tendencies becoming more or less prominent in the Sangha at large. So it seems that in the decades and centuries after the Buddha's passing, the ascetic monks became much more praised, much more of a role model. But we know that after that period, there was a counter movement, and there was a movement towards more compassion, towards more social engagement. And these are the very early beginnings of what later becomes the Mahayana tradition, with the bodhisattva ideal, with like compassion and social engagement at the forefront, which, as I mentioned, is a counter movement to these first few decades or centuries where things became so ascetic that it was a little bit out of balance. So over time, we see, the Sangha moving back and forth between these two extremes, and trying to find the middle path over and over. And it's something that we're still exploring in modern times. And I think something that will continue to be explored by monastics as long as this Buddha's dispensation lasts. So it's not something that we can actually resolve. It's something that everybody will sort of struggle with or explore, and something that I think everybody has to find their own way within, these broad tendencies. So I hope that you enjoyed this course. I hope that it was insightful for you. I hope you learned a little bit. And now, if you have any questions about this sutta or about the course at large, about suttas we read the last few weeks and months, and then please feel free to type them in the live chat, and I will do my best to address them. And I see a few more people have joined. Welcome to Jayanta, nice to see you, and welcome to Roy. And I see Gita has typed a few things here. I wasn't Venerable Bakkula, the last monastic to be ordained by the Buddha. I think that a monk was called Baddiya, not Bakkula. So I think I'm quite sure that's a different person. And Gita said, wow, I don't know what you were saying wow to, what you're looking sad. You put some sad smileys there. So I'm assuming you're saying wow to one of the more questionable practices, maybe the ones that that relate to women, or the ones that relate to ordinations. Yes. So other than that, I don't see any questions so far. I'm glad you enjoyed the course, Gita. Thank you for tuning in so diligently almost every time. And if there are no further questions, then I think we can finish up for today. And as usual, we will finish with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join me if you want to join. Sadhu, sadhu.